Welcome back. Don't forget to share with us throughout the day using the hashtag NEVirtualCTE2020. Each post gets you entered to win door prizes at the end of the day. I have the great privilege to welcome our next featured speaker. Sydney Jensen is a 9th grade English teacher and instructional coordinator at Lincoln High School and the 2019 Nebraska Teacher of the Year. As a teacher and an ambassador for public education, she is a passionate advocate for increased mental and emotional wellness support for both students and the teachers who serve them. She recorded an official TED Talk on the impact of secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue on teachers who work with students experiencing trauma. Her talk has received over 2 million views to date. During Sydney's presentation, please use the question and answer feature to ask your questions. If time allows, she will answer some of your questions. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Sydney Jensen from Lincoln High School.
All right, good morning. First of all, I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. Again, my name is Sydney Jensen. I have the privilege and the honor to teach and serve at Lincoln High in Lincoln, Nebraska. There I teach 9th grade English, and I also am able to serve in the capacity of an instructional coordinator, which means that I get to partner with new and veteran teachers to help them reach their instructional goals and serve in sort of a mentoring role. And I am just so excited to be here with y'all this morning to be able to share a little bit about my teaching journey, some of the things that I've learned along the way, and to talk about some of those things that I'm really passionate about, like teacher mental health and wellness. I want to start out by posing this question: where do I go from here? That's sort of the theme of this presentation. It's a question that I know CTE teachers help students answer every single day. Where do I go from here after I finish this class, this grade level, once I graduate from high school? As teachers and school leaders, we should constantly be asking ourselves, where am I and where do I go from here? But I guess it's important to sort of start at the beginning. Where did we come from? You might be realizing that I don't sound like I'm from Nebraska, and that's because I'm not from around here. I grew up in Eatonton, Georgia. It's a small town, pretty much dead center in the state. We're very well known for our peaches down in Georgia, and peach stands are a big sort of cultural element to where I grew up. This picture is a peach stand right down the road from my parents' house in Eatonton. You might recognize it if you're super familiar with the 1992 hit movie My Cousin Vinny, because it was prominently featured in the opening credits. It's most noteworthy because if you look really close on the side of the peach stand, they actually spelled the word peaches wrong, which has turned it into quite a landmark around Eatonton. But I loved growing up in Eatonton. Eatonton is a dairy farming community primarily. If your parents aren't dairy farmers, they probably work in manufacturing. And because of that baseline in our economy, we had a really strong CTE program, especially in agriculture at my high school. And I think about all the lessons that I learned in those classes, and I think about y'all as teachers in those areas. And our kids in Nebraska are so lucky to have you. After high school, I went on to the University of Georgia, where I studied English education. So if you look really closely in this presentation, you might see some little Easter eggs representing some of my favorite books. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to work as a camp counselor at YMCA Camp Kentucky, and that's what brought me here to Nebraska. I never went to summer camp as a kid. My family could never have afforded that for us. And so I saw it on TV shows like Salute Your Shorts in the 90s on Nickelodeon. And I thought it sounded really cool to work at a summer camp. It was while working there that I met my husband, and now we've been married for 6 years. And that's what brought me to Lincoln Public Schools and to Lincoln High School. But when I really think about it, I left high school thinking that I was going to be a pharmacist. And it wasn't until working at summer camp that I realized I really wanted to be a teacher. And weirdly, that story kind of starts with turtles. It was while I was working at summer camp. I was counseling a cabin of probably 10 or 12 10-year-old girls. And one night we were walking through camp to go to bed, and we noticed this turtle next to this beautiful pond that's sort of right in the center of Camp Kentucky. And this turtle was digging a hole to lay her eggs in. And we thought it was really cool. And I don't know anything about turtles, but we went over to the Nature Lodge, looked in the little camp library, and we were able to find a book with a section on turtles. And with that book, we went to our cabin and we got our sleeping bags and some snacks, and we decided that we were going to stay up and watch this mama turtle work. And anytime another cabin walked by, whether they were going to the shower house or they were going off to bed, or, you know, a group of kids going to the bathroom, we excitedly stopped them to tell them all about this miracle of nature that we were witnessing. And we rattled off all the turtle facts we had just learned 5 minutes ago. And it was really fun. And that was sort of that moment, where do I go from here, where I realized I really liked learning with kids. And so I got back to the University of Georgia and I changed my major. I picked English because I felt like that was something I was good at and something I enjoyed. And that changed my whole life, that one little moment with those turtles. And sometimes I think about if that had the same impact or any sort of impact on those girls. And it wasn't until years later that I learned the impact that that had on those kids. This is a post from the YMCA Camp Kentucky Facebook page that they posted about a year ago, I guess, a little over a year ago, where the camp director posted a picture of, or a video of a mama turtle digging a hole to lay some eggs, practically in that same spot. And I saw it and I was like, oh, that's pretty neat. And then I looked at the comments, and there was this comment from one of my campers. She said, it must have been the 2010 era. I remember how fascinating my cabin mates and I thought that mama turtle and her babies were. Lots of hours spent watching, glad to see the next generation continuing the tradition. And that's the thing about teaching, is that often we don't understand the impact of what we're doing until years later. That moment meant so much to me, and to hear that it meant anything to those girls, that it was something worth remembering, that it was a fond memory that they looked back on at least, really solidified that I felt like I was in the right place at the right time. But my first where do I go from here moment as a teacher really happened with a student named David. David was in my reading elements class at Lincoln High. And if you're not familiar with reading elements, it's really a class for high school students who are reading on a 3rd to 5th grade reading level. And so it's our job as teachers to help them build their reading proficiency so that they can pass the reading graduation exam. And so it's a pretty big challenge. And this student, David, he was very quiet. He sort of sat in the back corner of the room, never raised his hand to ask questions. And it was the last day of school, and I was telling kids to have a great summer. And he was the last student out the door. And I said, have a great summer. And he looked at me and he smiled and he nodded. And I remember so clearly watching him walk down the hallway and turn to go down the stairs to leave. And I thought to myself, I don't even know what his voice sounds like. I realized that I had really turned into the sage on the stage. I was doing all of the talking in my classroom. And when I really reflected on it, I didn't know anything about David's learning in my class until he took the test or wrote the essay. But the harder thing to think about was even those extroverted students, the ones who came bounding in to tell me about their baseball game, what they did that weekend, you know, their birthday coming up. I wasn't giving them any opportunities to actively learn in my class either. And even though I knew more about them as people, I don't know that I knew much more about them and their learning than I did David. And that's something that I think CTE teachers have known for a long time. How to shift their teaching to suit students who are entering a different type of workforce than our parents or our grandparents' generation. CTE teachers are so good at providing hands-on opportunities to learn, and that's something that the rest of us can really learn from. And so my answer with that situation with David of where do I go from here really turned into, I need to figure out how to make students in charge of their learning in my classroom. And so I changed really everything about the way that I taught. I made my classroom a space where students were doing most of the talking instead of me doing most of the talking. And that was through a lot of professional learning and trial and error and doing things in the classroom that really terrified me in terms of losing control. But they paid off hugely. And I'm so thankful that I got to have David in class again, actually that next year. And I learned so much about him, even as an introverted student. He started to be more open in his writing. He was more open in sharing aloud with the class through little things like providing just sentence frames to help verbalize the learning for those kids who were less likely to use their own voice. And it was through that I also learned about all the pain that he had been experiencing outside of my classroom, things that I couldn't possibly understand or relate to. It turned out that David's father was in Mexico and couldn't be in the United States with him and his mother. And he was acting out in a lot of ways because all he wanted was for his family to be together. And when I think back on my experience in Eatonton, you know, I came to Lincoln thinking that I understood it all, that I had come from poverty, that I'd come from tough situations at home. And that was the first major lesson in learning that I can't relate to everyone's experience in my classroom. So I invite you to humor me a little and look at your hand. And when you look at your hand, sort of imagine that each of your fingers represents some key piece of your identity. So if you have the sort of 5 major key points of who you are as a person, picture those on your hand. Think about ideologies, your age, gender and gender identity, ethnicity, race, abilities, indigenous membership, political beliefs, personal experiences, religious beliefs. What are those sort of 5 pillars of your identity and the way that you read the world? You know, if you hold up your hand and you look through those 5 fingers, that's the way that you sort of instinctually see the world. Now for me, I see myself hugely as a partner. I have the best husband in the world. He's so supportive. We take our dog on a walk together every day. And he's the person that I'm able to bounce ideas off of. He gives me great advice. He's a great listener. And in every choice that I make, I do it in the hopes that it's going to benefit both of us. I hugely identify as a Southerner. My whole family is still there. That's a huge part of my culture. A big part of my identity is as a teacher and a student and a learner. I also consider myself a social justice warrior and an activist for equity, not only in education, but in everything in our world. And I also know that as a white woman, I view the world through a sense of privilege. And so the challenge then is to think about if that's what I see when I view the world, are those 5 things, then what are my blind spots? What are the things on the other side of my hand that I'm missing? And as a teacher trying to serve my students, how can I constantly be intentionally working to sort of flip that hand around and be able to see things from the perspective of students who have experiences that are vastly different from my own? Especially right now, we are all experiencing a certain level of trauma through this pandemic. And there are different definitions of, or different types of trauma. There's that single incident trauma where there's an event, an accident, an assault. But things like poverty are complex trauma. Things like the COVID-19 pandemic is complex trauma. It's ongoing. It's not one moment. It is something that all of our students are experiencing to some degree, and I would argue all of us are experiencing it to some degree as well. 86% of teachers across early childhood settings experienced some depressive symptoms during the prior week. And 62% of high poverty schools report that it's challenging to retain high quality teachers. That is the impact of trauma in our classrooms. It's called secondary trauma, that we as teachers, the hard part of teaching is all of the stuff that we carry home with us, metaphorically, at the end of the school day, all the problems we can't solve for our students the moment they leave our classrooms, all the worry that we feel every time we go out on an extended break, whether it's spring break, winter break, or losing the entire fourth quarter because of the pandemic. And when teachers are experiencing that level of trauma, we have to make sure that we're doing something to help teachers maintain their own wellness, because we can't pour from an empty cup. This study, I think, really illustrates that. There was a study a couple years ago in 2019, it was published. They studied more than 400 elementary and middle school students in 17 different schools, and they found that teachers who reported higher levels of burnout had students with the highest levels of the stress hormone cortisol every morning. And that really illustrates that when our teachers are under great stress in our classrooms and feeling unsupported to manage that stress that we absorb from our students and their circumstances, that directly impacts our students in our classroom. And the impact is negative. So by not providing mental wellness supports to our teachers and practicing mental wellness for ourselves intentionally on purpose, we are effectively harming the children that we're working to care for. So here are some ways that buildings and districts can support teacher wellness: adequate counselor availability for teachers and students, and making space for tough conversations. Teachers have so much on their plate already with lesson planning, trying to ensure that our students are going to lead successful lives outside of our care once they graduate and they enter the workforce. And we have to be able to make space on that full plate for those conversations to happen. Because another hard part of teaching is to feel like you're the only one struggling with something. We shut our door and we teach in isolation, and it's easy to convince ourselves that nobody else is having the same struggles that we are. The more that we sort of peel back the curtain and share those struggles with one another, the better off we all are. And that last one, I really believe that knowledge is power. When we as teachers are more informed about the resources that are available to our students, there's more hope embedded in those feelings that we can really connect our students to community resources, that we as teachers have the power to help our students through those tough situations. And we're truly in an unknown era in education. The COVID-19 outbreak has really put equity under a microscope, a magnifying glass. We're seeing the struggle of students who live in poverty, who lack convenient and ongoing access to the internet. We're seeing equity issues with students who are spending a great deal of their time managing their household during this pandemic. And it's causing us to ask a lot of questions about where do we go from here? And I think about specifically the stages of grief and how I felt when it was announced that we wouldn't be back fourth quarter. And I think all teachers, to some degree, all educators felt some sense of grief in that moment. There might have been some things, yes, that were a little bit of a relief. You know, spending a little more time with family, losing that commute in the morning. But we also thought about all of the moments that we're missing with our kids, all the learning that we knew would suffer as a result of this. And when I think about the stages of grief, I certainly think I went through all of them. Blame, denial, all of that. But what's interesting is that the people who originally wrote the book about the 5 stages of grief, years later, published another book where they identified a 6th stage. And they said that that 6th stage of grief is finding meaning. One of my favorite books is called Stranger in a Strange Land. And if you're not familiar with it, it's about a character named Michael who was raised on Mars. He's truly a Martian. I know it sounds kind of silly. And he comes to Earth and he realizes that there's this word in Martian that doesn't really have an English equivalent, and the word is grok. And he talks about grok and explains it to mean that it's a word to encompass the feeling when you're just so grateful for a moment. And so it's that you drink fully of this moment. And he talks about, on Mars, everything is so precious. A breath of air, a tiny drop of water is so precious. And on Earth, we sort of take those things for granted. And I think about all the things I took for granted before all of this happened. One of my colleagues recently told me, she was like, I'm going to love so much more intentionally when this stupid virus is over. And I thought that's such a great thing to take away from this experience. And so even though we're in the midst of this time of struggle, how do we grok from here? How do we drink fully of this moment that we're sharing together and turn it into something that's meaningful? What do we change in education, whether it's in our own personal classroom practices, in our department, in our building, in our district, or in our state? What is it that we're going to advocate for to ensure equity for our students based on this experience? And I think one of the big elements of that is that this has reiterated how much relationships matter now more than ever. In education, we often say we have to Maslow before we can bloom. We have to make sure that our students are fed and warm and loved, cared for, empowered before they can experience true learning. And I think one thing that we've learned through all of this is it's not enough just to have the resources. We have to have the relationships to reach those who need them. In my classroom, I do a little activity just as sort of an icebreaker at the beginning of the school year. I'm very proud to work at Lincoln High. And if you're not super familiar with Lincoln High, our mascot is the lynx, not like the animal, but like a chain. To our knowledge, we are the only high school in the world who uses that as a mascot. And we have this really great statue out front of our building that was donated by one of the graduating classes of yesteryear, I think from the 70s. And it's 4 links connected as a chain, and each link means something. At Lincoln High, our links stand for tradition, excellence, unity, and diversity. And as a 9th grade teacher, a lot of my job is to help our 9th graders feel like they're part of Lincoln High, feel like they're part of our community and part of our culture. And so that first day I teach them about the links. We don't talk about the syllabus really at all, but I teach them about the history of Lincoln High and the history of those links and the meaning that exists behind them. And then I give them each a little slip of paper, and I ask them on that paper to write down something that describes their identity. What are the words that really encapsulate how they view themselves and how they frame the world? And then I go around with a stapler and staple them all together as a daisy chain, and then they hang up as a symbol of our unity, of our commitment to each other, that we are part of something that's bigger than ourselves. Those links are connected to the links from the grades before them who have sat in that same classroom. And it becomes something that's a concrete visual that we're all connected and we're all in this together. And no matter where we go from here, we'll always be Lincoln High. And when we're able to deeply root ourselves in those relationships, that's when we are able to have the biggest impact. That's when we're able to guide our students to a future career that they're going to love. That's when we're able to talk to our students about really tough things going on at home. That's when we're able to connect them to resources in the community who can help. And that's when we as teachers feel like we're really in that sweet spot of teaching, that we're truly in the right place at the right time. So my challenge to you as we move forward in this experience is to lean into that idea of grok, even in the midst of the unknown, even in uncertainty about what August will look like and what beyond August will look like, in the midst of all those fears. What will COVID-19 teach you? What will it inspire you to change for yourself and for the benefit of your students? Basically, how will you grok? Where do we go from here? Thank you so much for going on this adventure with me. I am so honored to have been asked to share this time with you. I look forward to hearing from you in the future, and I know that tuning into this conference, I've experienced so much learning, and so I'm so thankful to have been able to join you. If you have any questions, I know that there's a Q&A feature, and so you're invited to use that. Additionally, I've got my contact information up on the screen, and you are always invited to reach out to me. But thank you so much.
Sydney, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your story. I think we can certainly take so much from what you said. As a proud family and consumer sciences teacher, relationships are number one for us. And so I think it's certainly such a great opportunity. I'm not getting very many questions, certainly lots of compliments. And so that's a call to the group. If you have any questions that you would like to share, we would love to share those with Sydney. One question is, if online learning is to take place this fall, how will you build community in your classes?
That's definitely something that I'm thinking ahead about. I think that that was a big challenge, is when we shifted to online learning, was that I felt like I had done so much work in my classroom to build that sense of community. And how was I going to maintain that in a virtual setting? And that was with 3/4 of time together in person. And so this coming year with incoming ninth graders, if we have to start with remote learning, I think that's going to be something that's going to be a real challenge to face, is not only building relationships with students who have never shared a building with me, but also making sure that they feel like they're a part of our community. That's so important for ninth graders to get plugged in right away, so that they're invested in their high school experience. So certainly using Zoom, but I think also one of the biggest things that worked for me in Q4 was picking up the phone and calling when a student wasn't attending Zoom classes. And there's so much power in having that one-on-one conversation with kids. And so that's something that I want to commit to if we are starting out with remote learning, because if I can build a relationship with the student, then hopefully then they'll join in virtually, so that we can do some community building through things like breakout rooms and small group discussions and stuff like that.
Great suggestions. Another questions, and I'm going to paraphrase because two of them are kind of similar, but what are some precautions? What are some things, what advice do you have for teachers that, when a student opens up to you or they're sharing a personal issue or story or something that's they're experiencing, what is some advice that you have for teachers in supporting them and following through with your students and others who may need to be involved in their support?
Sure. At Lincoln High, think that we are really lucky. A few years ago, we started to transition our practices to being more restorative and affirmative. And so we've had a good deal of professional development on using affirmative language. And so what that looks like is when a student comes to us and they're upset, sometimes they're upset at me, sometimes they're upset with a home situation or with a peer, that really the first step is to affirm those feelings, whatever they are. And I think that's something even right now we're experiencing, especially with our senior class, who have every right to be upset and sad and in grief over losing things like in-person graduation and prom and graduation parties, all these things that they've worked really hard for and looked forward to. And it's easy for them to feel like, there are bigger things happening in the world and it's petty for me to be upset about this. But I think it's important to remind students that, this is not a misery competition. And they're allowed to feel sad. They did work hard and they did deserve those things, and it's not fair. And so I think that's a big thing in my classroom when students are having a hard time, is to make sure that I validate those feelings for them so that then we can hopefully work towards some sort of resolution. But to tell someone they can't feel the way they feel, I think is not a great starting point.
Absolutely. Another question, and certainly after Q4, additional teachers might be feeling this way. Have you experienced burnout? And then the second part of that question, what did you do when you experienced maybe that feeling or pieces of that feeling? What do you do to get re-energized and inspired?
I've absolutely experienced burnout. I think that I was sort of going through that in third quarter this year. We got a new curriculum, and as I'm sure everyone has experienced, new curriculums can be very challenging to try and work the kinks out and make sure that everything is making sense and building in a natural and meaningful way. And I really felt like this new unit we introduced did not go the way that I had hoped. And when I reflect on getting that news, while it was devastating that we weren't going to come back after spring break, there was a small twinge of relief of like, ooh, at least we can pretend that never happened. And so, I think burnout comes in a lot of ways. It comes from exhaustion. It comes from feeling like, gosh, why can't I get this right? It comes from just being overwhelmed with so many things on our plate. It comes from that secondary trauma. And so I have to be really intentional about my own wellness. And something that I've done is I literally sat down and sort of wrote out my own wellness creed. Like, here are the things that I commit to myself, that even though I'm working from home, that doesn't mean that I'm working every moment that I'm awake. I can't be on my computer until 10 o'clock at night. And so work stops at 4. And that was a commitment I made to myself. And then I made commitments to my school and my school community that I'm going to make sure that I respond within 24 hours, that I'm going to spend at least 15 minutes a day intentionally engaging in some sort of professional learning, whether it's reading something or watching a video, to prepare for remote learning if it does continue in the fall. And that's something that, it's part of my wellness creed, because if I don't do that, I know that August will come and I'll be in a panic. And so I think that intentionality of sitting down and thinking, here are the things that I need to make sure that I'm doing for myself, that's been really helpful for my own wellness and responding to that burnout.
Thank you. A few additional questions that relate back to some of the resources and examples you shared. And so as we connect afterwards and maybe share your presentation, there has been a request to share the handprint analogy, if there be a way that you can share that with teachers. And then additionally, if you don't mind, would you just kind of share the paper chain and how you use that with students and having a conversation with them about links and making connections?
Absolutely. I'm happy to share those. I actually have sort of a typed out lesson plan for the paper chain, which is available for free on my website, sydney-jensen.com. And so you can always go there to be able to view that, and it sort of explains all of it. And I can certainly put together something with the handprint that we can share with teachers as well. I think those are two really great ways. You know, I'm an English teacher, so I'm all about metaphors. But they're really concrete ways to symbolize some of those things that are really important for building community.